The questions the House do now adjourn. I call the member for McMahon.
Thank you very much, Speaker. Tonight I wish to raise in the House of Representatives the plight of the Copts of Egypt. Copts make up between 5 and 10% of Egypt's population, but they are suffering persecution and they are suffering violence in a growing concern. Copts have always been a group in Egypt which has been at risk, but now we are seeing the Coptic community having their property stolen or destroyed, their members harassed and beaten, and their places of worship burnt or demolished. Due to the recent increase in attacks, Speaker, we've seen an estimated 100,000 Coptic people leave the nation of Egypt. Now, it's very clear that there is an obligation on every government, on every nation of the world, to provide protection to its citizens. Protection regardless of race, regardless of religion, but provide protection to its citizens, and that obligation falls on the government of Egypt just as it falls on every other government in the world. We saw perhaps the first spectacular outbreak of violence with the Maspero massacre of October 2011, in which Copts staged a peaceful demonstration outside of a local television station protesting against the demolition of a church in northern Egypt. I recall by happenstance I was visiting St Mark's Church of Coptic Church of Arncliffe the next day, and I recall being briefed on the events in Maspero Square the night before, just before I visited the Church of St Mark's in Arncliffe, and talking to the congregation of that church about the Australian government's concerns. We saw the deaths of over 20 Coptic Christians in that massacre and the injurement of many, many others. And of course we saw St Mark and Pope Peter Church in 2011 being attacked. And more recently we've seen more attacks on the Cathedral of St Mark in Egypt. And an attack on a cathedral anywhere is of course an attack on cathedrals and on freedom everywhere, Speaker. And I know that there are many, many people in Australia who are deeply concerned about the situation of Copts in Egypt, as I am, as other members of the House are, and as the government is. I know the Foreign Minister, Bob Carr, is very alive to these concerns. I know he has raised the plight of Copts directly with President Morsi. I know he's also raised the plight of Christians in the Middle East more generally with former Secretary of State Clinton, current Secretary of State Kerry, and Foreign Secretary Haig. I also think it's important that Australia uses its role as a member of the UN Security Council to be prosecuting the case for enhanced protection of Christians in the Middle East. I think the plight of Christians in the Middle East is one of the world's crises at the moment, which is not receiving enough attention. And clearly the plight of the Copts of Egypt is one of those situations which is not receiving enough attention, and all members of the House and the other place would do well to ensure that it receives more attention. I know that former Foreign Minister Rudd felt this matter particularly keenly, and he hosted a reception of Copts on his visit to Egypt when he was Foreign Minister of Australia. It's been my great pleasure to work with many members of the Coptic community, to work with Sayyidna Bishop Daniel and Sayyidna Bishop Suriel of Melbourne on these issues, both in my time as a minister in the government and as a member for McMahon, with the Australian Coptic movement, and I've attended their rallies, including a recent rally at Sydney at Martin Place. We had hoped that the earlier rallies would be the last. We had hoped that the rallies in 2011 would be the last, because we would no longer need to rally for freedom of religion for the Copts of Egypt. But alas, we have had to continue to rally. Alas, we have had to continue to fight and argue, and we will continue to do so. As I say, Speaker, it is incumbent on all governments to protect their citizens in every regard. It is incumbent on all governments to ensure that their people can live in peace and freedom and harmony. And the Copts of Egypt are not currently living in peace and freedom and harmony, and it is incumbent on the government of Egypt to ensure that they can. In many cases, the revolution we've seen in the Middle East has resulted in poor outcomes, in worse outcomes for Christians. We've seen that in Iraq. We are seeing that now in Egypt. The Arab Spring has turned to an Arab winter for many, many people in the Middle East. Those people in the Middle East, in Egypt, and their friends and relatives in Australia, in my electorate and in electorates around the country, need to know they have many friends in the House of Representatives.